Good evening, nerds, and welcome back to a very little rock and stone bonus episode for you all. I have heard your cries, people wanting some Votann content out of me. It's Tom Lowest of Men of 6 Plus here, and I'm going to make sure you guys get your Votann fix. Now, Jake and James Marsden both very, very busy at the moment with real life things, so I thought it was important to just get this recorded, and I had to think about what I wanted to do to give you guys some Votann content, and basically, I think it's nice to do a sort of detailed reflection of playing the army, playing Leagues of Votann in the new Pariah Nexus meta and game. And I'm going to organize this in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because as I've talked about on other shows, I think Votann are in a solid spot. There's plenty of good going for them, especially in a team's environment. But there are maybe one or two things that are a little bit tough for them. And, I think we're all really starting to feel the need for some good news about next releases and next splash release and all those things for Votann as well. So without further ado, we'll get into it. Please do hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. We really appreciate it. So let's talk Votann in Pariah. The stats are bang average the 6 way. They've got a 50% win rate. They're solid. Their overrep is not high. They have a very small percentage of players hitting that 4-0 event winning position. They have not won an event in Pariah Nexus, as far as I'm aware, although there's rumours that maybe one was won this very weekend, but I need to check into that. And if I do, I'll do another episode looking at the list and finding out how that went. And they have a 3% player population. So in general, Votann are doing fine. You can win games with them. They are not a sort of event-topping powerhouse. They are not one of the sort of overtuned armies. I don't think they need anything by way of negative adjustment. If anything, possibly some boosts to some of the units that you don't see would be cool. And they have a relatively small but dedicated player population at this point, which was part of what attracted me to Votann in the first place. So I'm glad people are still playing and enjoying the army and still out there. I think that's excellent. And what I would say, certainly from my own experience in the sort of teams world over the last year, is that Votann are a very solid 7th or 8th pick in a teams list. To have a very, again, solid, dependable army with a good floor that can body certain kinds of lists and builds as well. So they definitely have play in those environments as well. So we're going to start with the good because I'm an optimistic guy. It's fun to talk about the positives. And Votann are enjoying Pariah Nexus for a number of different reasons that I will unpack in detail. The first one is that they're very well suited to the new primary missions. They like the primary, they play it well, they're very solid at just playing the mission as dealt, and they have all the right tools to do it. They also prefer the new secondary missions, and particularly the impact on other armies, to how it was before, which we'll get into. Basically, the new pack suits the way Votann play, and the fact that secondaries in general are a bit harder obviously helps Votann too. Finally, they have a good suite of units to adapt to the meta. And we'll talk about some of those in detail, but basically, although it's not a big roster, the Votann Index does have a nice range of tools, and we can see in Votann lists that have been developed more recently that you can pivot into a slightly different set of tools to what they were doing before, and actually have a list that's very nasty and well suited to deal with certain kinds of armies out there in the game at large. So let's just unpack this a bit more. So why are Votann good at the new primary missions? Well, I think the new primary missions reward the sort of locking down of midboard space and using those to score, often with additional tasks given on top. Think about Terraform or Burden of Trust, or just be solid in the midboard and get a bunch of points, especially towards the end of the game, a la Linchpin. This is how Votann play. They wheel towards the middle, they bring all their forces and concentrate them in the middle of the board, and they're good at being there en masse and being very solid and going toe-to-toe with the opponent. And a lot of the new primary really, really rewards this. They also enjoy going second because they're a durable army. They can play the long game, keep their assets alive, and benefit from several of the missions that have a good end game swing. They're not fragile. They don't tend to burn out. And if you're conservative with your resources and force the opponent to come and dig you out, then Votann are very well placed to be able to jam things towards the end of a game and benefit from the end game swing as well. So in general, the primary suits Votann. I think this suits them very happily. As far as new secondary missions go, there's been a slight shift in the focus of where in the board secondary missions want you to be. So there's a lot more by way of sort of action-based points to be got by being in the midboard, by being hunkered down in terrain, in and around the midboard. So things like containment can be scored on the flanks there, often from safety with small throwaway units like warriors. You've got sabotage and recover assets, where again, Votann have these durable, tough units, especially the transports or fight on death berserks who can lock down in cover, say, right, we're going to do this action, and it's very hard for you to interact with this or stop us, and you're going to get hurt if you come towards us. So in general, The shift in the secondaries and the way that some of the movement ones have been changed to be less punishing, things like engage, it's easier to score now. And some of the ones that faster, quicker, jankier armies benefited the most from have either gone away, as with investigate signals, or have been reduced in terms of how much they reward you. So the overall effect here is that Votann are able to eke out more points for playing the game the way they are designed to. And a lot of the armies that used to dance around them and score very highly in secondaries now actually don't tend to be maxing out secondaries quite as easily and in quite the same way. So it's a slightly more level playing field. You've got a situation where Votann play the primary well. Other armies are maybe getting slightly less of an edge on them on the secondaries. In the overall sort of state of the game, that puts Votann in a very nice and solid spot. So plenty to be optimistic about there. If we're thinking about unit options, this is where things have got really exciting for Votann, because obviously we have a new superstar. We have the Jaggers. This is an incredibly cheap infiltrating unit. So forward deploying, only 80 points, decent with little plasma knives for combat, which can be juiced up to AP4, very tasty. They've got a reactive move, D6 reactive move, which gives you a little bit of interplay and sneakiness in the midboard, either to block or to deny enemy charges. And crucially, they allow you to kind of keep channels in the midboard open for your scout moving things if you want to push an alpha strike on a flank. They allow you to prevent being jailed and blocked in by the opponent all across the board, which was something that could happen to Votann before. And they're just incredibly cheap. And it gives you another cheap throwaway unit, which Votann lacked outside of Warriors, that can help you to get more judgment tokens going as well when they do eventually meet their inevitable demise. And also gives you the option of some forward pressure as well, although I tend to see them and use them as something hunkered down in a ruin, kind of drawing the opponent out. In general, our transport-based game plan really suits Pariah Nexus, as other armies like Jaggers have been demonstrating, and Sisters, and these kinds of builds where transports are really useful, give you multiple ways to score and play without losing too much efficiency in your output. And so the Sagittar remains as amazing as it's ever been. The High-Las Sagittar is still brilliant, but we've also seen an increase in lists taking land forts, because land forts are very durable. Some of the armies in the game that killed land forts the most effortlessly, and I'm looking at you, Eldar, have gone away and are much less prevalent now, which means it's a lot easier for you to take a land fort or two out and be confident that in a lot of games that's going to be great, going to give you that land raider energy, parked with void armor being really tough to remove, really effective staging tool for larger units of berserks, or some of your thunderkin, or in small squads of Hearthguard as well. We also have utility idiots in Warriors. Warriors, obviously, great throwaway OC, great throwaway action doers or scorers, cheap, cheerful, and they get you judgment tokens. So what's not to like? Warriors just as useful as ever. And finally, we've got the threat of the Pioneers. The Pioneers, I've not talked about Berserks, we're going to go back, don't you worry. But Pioneers, these are just a great shooting unit in a meta that's got a lot of Space Marines in it. If you're shooting at Thousand Suns or Blood Angels, any kind of sort of non-Terminator Marine, then Pioneers are a sensational unit. And what they give you in Votann is some mobility you don't otherwise have, right? The ability to go off a board edge and come in. If you keep your Pioneers safe, and this is something I always advise Votann players to do, is don't give them away straight away. Keep them in the back. Keep the threat of them appearing and starting to pick the opponent off on the board edges open until later in the game. And as long as you exercise that threat, they force the opponent to keep resources back and screen, which strengthens you in the midboard by default. And if they don't, that gives you massive ins to get in behind and start bodying them and taking them off their home objective and everything else. So I really like the squad of 6 Pioneers, especially for Ancestral Sentence, for the double sustain, because for reasons we'll get into, the big Hearthguard brick maybe isn't quite as useful in as many games as it previously was, which means you're looking elsewhere for units that are going to really, really benefit from that stratagem. And I think Pioneers are the one. Now let's talk Berserks. So Berserks have been in vogue. We're seeing lists with 20 or 25 Berserks. And the reality is that, again, in an environment where things like Night Spinners have gone away, slowing effects are on the down, there's a lot less artillery, Berserks become very nice as a unit you can stage and hide behind walls and say, well, if you come and fight me, I'll be fighting on death anyway. They are a very potent unit as long as you apply them to judged targets, whether that's 1 judgment or 2. Berserks can then be amped up with Warrior Pride to make them AP 3 or 4 on their damage 3 hammers with +1 to hit and potentially +1 to hit and wound. There are not many durable targets in the game that can survive contact from 10 Berserks. Really, really potent unit. Very, very effective. And obviously, you get the mole launcher for some slow. The feel no pain. And on a big unit of 10, you've got 2 mole launcher guys with 3 wounds each for absorbing some of the attacks with the feel no pain on the 5 up as well. So they can just absorb different kinds of damage to the other Votann units. They're one of the only units in the index that isn't vulnerable to mortal wounds, which is a big problem for Hearthguard, right? If we're thinking about the wider meta and the ongoing prevalence of Thousand Suns in particular, but also Seraphim as well. So Berserks are having a great moment, and it's worth saying, 10 of them is only 200 points as compared to 160, but more for 5 Hearthguard and a leader. And you are getting significantly more by way of wounds and durability. You are losing the shooting threat, but you are getting a different kind of durability and incredible dangerous offense. So they're very good in a meta with combat armies like Blood Angels that want to come and play. If Dark Angels do let them connect into them, even Deathwing Knights will be a little bit afraid of juiced up Berserks as well, although the reactive move there make life a little bit difficult for the stunties. So all in all, although it's a small index, what we're seeing is evidence that you can still build and pivot in different directions to get the tools that you need. And I think that's a credit to the way the rest of the game is being rebalanced so that the tools in Votann Index can keep up. But in general, it just shows that there's a good suite of tools here, and I'm really excited personally to see what they add to them going forwards. All right. We've been sunny, we've been positive. Let's talk about some of the issues, some of the negatives. So I think for Votann and Pariah, a couple of the primary issues they are having are that they're not particularly good at secret missions, which means they can be vulnerable to quick armies that are able to position around them and score secret missions, which undoes all their good work on the primary. But also, I think a lot of the top armies have the edge in terms of their speed and repositioning and general shenanigans, the very best kind of nanigans. This is tough for Votann, and this I think is why we're not seeing them making it to the very top of events. They can win a lot of games, but they're not closing out events in the main because there's quite a lot of stuff in the meta that still has the edge over them in terms of its resources and basically its rules as well a lot of the time. So let's explore that a little bit. So, secret missions. Votann themselves are not particularly good at secret missions. The only one they are realistically going to be consistently doing is Unbroken Wall, which is the walking onto all 3 objectives at the end. And to be honest, if you're in the situation to do that, and you comfortably know in turn 3 you're going to be able to do that, you're probably already well up in the game anyway. And because Votann are an army that play the baseline primary really well, you usually want to be trying to build up an honest primary lead, which makes actually taking this much less likely. Your warriors don't tend to be alive by the late game. Your warlords are very slow and easy to map. So that shuts off quite a few of the others. And then the tabling one, well, again, if you've basically tabled them, you've basically won already. So that's not much of a consideration. This means that Votann, like the index in general, are trying to win the honest, old-fashioned way. They're going to roll up, play the game, shoot and fight, and see where that gets them at the end. This means that I think in some situations, top armies have the edge against Votann, especially in terms of rules. Votann are what we call mappable. You know how fast they move. You know how far they can shoot. You know what their movements and threat ranges are, and they don't have ways to really alter this. The bikes are the obvious exception. The ability to redeploy around with the bikes gives them something that other armies don't always have, and that's why the bikes have to be protected. They have a huge target on their head as long as they're alive. But other targets, other units, your vehicles and your berserkers and other things can be mapped out fairly straightforwardly. Your deep strikers, if you try to play that way with the Hearthguard, can be screened and mapped again and controlled fairly easily as well. And so that means that a lot of the armies that simply aren't, like your double moving Thousand Suns or your incredibly quick Drakari, for example, uppy downy Hypercrypt, advanced and shooting Sisters, there's a bunch of the top armies in the game where it's actually very hard to map and model exactly where they can hit you. And that means that Votann struggle a little bit into these, where I think when it's 2 equal players, one's got a very clear sense of what the other one can do, and the other one is more vulnerable to being caught out by the counter plays. Non-interactive damage dealers are hard for Votann to engage, so Mortal Wounds, Thousand Suns particularly come to mind here, but I think Drakari with their popping out, killing things, popping back in transports, hiding behind walls are another good example. So there's a few again top armies in the game that can hit Votann on their terms. It's often quite hard for Votann to hit them on their terms, which is why I think Berserks are offering a new option, because Berserks can at least guarantee that if you do go in to fight me, you're getting killed too. as I've talked about many times, I think Votann is a very honest index. It plays good, honest 40k. That's what it's about. And the very best armies at the top of the game very rarely are honest 40k armies. So I think that kind of explains the pattern we're seeing with Votann, where they are a completely viable and solid option that you can take to an event. Good, balanced army. You can take to an event and expect to do well based on your ability. But if you do cut up into the very top rounds of an event, you're likely to come up against armies that just have more ways to play the game and more ways to come at you than Votann do, at which stage things start to get a little bit tricky for you. Finally, let's take it to the ugly. So there's a couple of things out there that do make life a little bit scary for Votann. The big one for me is new Vect auras, this adding CP auras, and I think these create enormous problems and challenges for Hearthguard in particular, which we'll unpack in a second. The army is very much locked into what I'd describe as a transport rush type build at the moment and has been all edition. That's kind of how it works. And unless we get some exciting news this week, it currently has no event wins in Pariah. So I think that all combined with the other factors we've looked at, you can make sense of a lot of these things. But let's talk about Vect in particular. New Vect is scary for Votann. Effectively, a Vect carrying unit has a 24-inch aura of adding 1 CP to the use of stratagems. Votann do not have captains. They do not have ways to make stratagems cheaper. Votann also have an incredible set of stratagems. They've got really good tools: adding AP, fallback shoot and charge, getting extra sustain 2 on your shooting, void armor. All of these tools are phenomenal. And Votann are an army that really love to use their stratagems very readily. And in an environment in Pariah where you're already occasionally paying CP to redraw secondaries to try and make sure you keep up on the score, Votann already have slightly less. They do get their boost via the detachment, which lets you get a bunch more when you kill a unit, but they still have to manage CP very carefully, and they typically like to have big go turns. And certainly the older list that had the Hearthguard bricks really liked to have go turns. The challenge they currently have is that if you hit an aura of +1 CP, that brick isn't going to be able to do all the things it wants to do because it's going to cost twice as much. And then in a defensive sense, popping things like interrupt, popping things like intervene, popping things like void armor defensively, as soon as you start to do even 1 or 2 of those things, you're going to drain all of your CP massively. Now, my assessment is that makes big Hearthguard bricks simply too unwieldy into a bunch of top armies to keep alive. There's simply too much risk that they get isolated by a Vector, and then your 400-point unit just gets evaporated and is unable to defend itself or apply its offensive abilities as effectively as you would like. So that's one of the reasons I'm a little bit down on Hearthguard, a little bit more up on Berserks and Pioneers that are cheaper and more independent, less CP needed in general to operate them too. And I think it takes the value of Berserks up, takes the value of spreading your threats wide as well, and just leaning hard into the units that can operate fairly effectively without much by way of CP investment. So Sagittars are still amazing for this. Pioneers are great for this as well. It doesn't mean you can't use Hearthguard, and I like the 5-mans in forts now. I think that gives you more ways to apply them and avoids too much of an investment. And you can still use things like the Champ as solo if you just want some mortal wounds and some hammer attacks. He's definitely still got some play as well as an annoying cheap character. So that's where we're at with Vect, and I think that's one of probably the biggest negative for Votann right now in terms of changing the landscape for them. But they do still have a lot of advantages, as we've unpacked, in other ways as well. And of course, transports. This is the build. We are all in on transports with Votann. Very transport heavy list, whether that's massed Sagittars or some Sagittars and some land forts. I think they give you the best way of playing Pariah, getting into the middle, surviving early exchanges, keeping your key hitters alive until the mid game, and then giving you also the best chance of just weathering enemy shooting and putting them away. And the ratios of what you take might differ, but the broad suite of units is very samey. And this is the index effect, right? And this is where we would desperately love to have had some news on Votann. My hope was that they'd be getting a book before Christmas. Sadly, that doesn't look to be the case, so we're going to be waiting a little while yet. Which means that at the moment, that's how this army works. Now, the good news is that means you can build and learn and iterate very consistently. The range of models in the index isn't big, which means you can collect and know that you've basically got the entire range at your fingertips. You can learn to play the army and have a very solid base of knowledge for when those new models come. But I think it also means that people are going to know how Votann work, can play against them fairly straightforwardly, and you do lack a bit for a plan B in a lot of different games. That's kind of how I tend to find Votann when I'm playing at the moment. I think the Jaggers is a huge quality of life improvement, and that does give you more give and go against a wider range of armies now. But in general, still going to be tricky for Votann to hit those heights with the current set of rules. So 0 event wins for Votann in Pariah. Now, hopefully we get some exciting news because there were rumours of a Votann event win. So I'll look into this for next time. And ultimately, Votann are solid and dependable, especially in teams. I cannot stress enough. If you want an army that's not going to let your side down in teams, is always going to bring back a solid score, whether it wins games or not. Votann are very good for this further down the picks once the obvious stronger armies have been taken. But they do struggle to get through the very best players and lists in singles at the top of the game. And that's been the way for a long time. That's been my experience playing them for the last year or so. So I think that's all to be expected. And at the moment, there are some great anti-elite damage dealers at the top of the game, Sisters, Drakari, Thousand Suns, that make their life just quite hard at the very top of the game. It'll be interesting to see what the balance slate does. I think Votann are an army where you could maybe chuck them a couple of buffs and see what happens. And hopefully some of their predators get nerfed and adjusted in different ways. But at the same time, they're in a lovely balanced spot. And ultimately, it's a small rule set. And I think we'll have to wait a little while before we see anything else exciting for Votann in terms of releases. Although I guess there's always the hope of another kill team, perhaps, in the short term with the new edition coming. You never know. So, going to do a little segment on the Jaegers for you to finish up because I know you guys like your lore. And this was where I had already put this on. Let me find it. So I was going to talk about the Jaegers. These are obviously the new unit, and they're pretty exciting. They're little skirmishing scouts, and I picked out a little lore segment for you. And basically, Jaegers are small squads of Hernkin who engage in extreme forward operations. They are the preliminary scout units. They go ahead of the rest of the kindred to prepare for the arrival of larger forces, and they can undertake sabotage of assets, guerrilla warfare, etc., etc. And because they take very dangerous sort of forward deploying work on, and you'll see on the tabletop they die a lot, there's a very real risk that the Jaeger can't be recovered and returned to the ancestral core of the Votann, which means Jaegers themselves make use of what are called legacy vaults, which are a black box that holds the scans of their brains of the Jaegers in it before they go on their missions. So this means that they can still be re-uploaded and brought back again in the future because they've kind of preemptively uploaded them into the ancestor core just in case it all goes wrong for them during the mission. So I really liked that. It's a little bit morbid. It's classic Votann with the sort of weird mix of sort of kinship and technology. And by all accounts, the Jaegers are very celebrated in the kin as well because of their very dangerous role. So I hope you enjoy that. All right, guys, that's it for this little bonus episode of Rock and Stone. I'd love to hear what you guys would like me to cover next because I know there's a few of you who are really enjoying the Votann content on 6++. So if there's things you'd like to hear, things you'd like me to do in the meantime before we get Jake and James back on again, let me know. I'd be more than happy to put different things together for you. Please do hit like and subscribe. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you liked about it, how you're finding Votann at the moment. Remember that you can come and join the party in the 6++ Discord, where there is a Votann chat that I'm always bubbling away in. And of course, if you are interested in signing up as a YouTube member and getting some Votann coaching as well via myself, I teach a few Votann players these days. I'm really enjoying that work. Then I would be more than happy to help you out. That's it for me for now, and I will see you all again next time. Bye-bye.